Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, shills, debt slaves, serfs, peasants, vassals, minions, meat sacks, historians. I'm a Useful Idiot, and I'm going to do another history-based video today because I really like the way the history shows us that nothing really changes. This game that the bankers play, that the elitists play, that the politicians play, all of these are old blueprints, and they're used over and over again. And why wouldn't they do that? Because it works well every time. And there's a great documentary called All Wars Are Banker Wars. And Smedley Butler, of course, published his book in 1934, War is a Racket, talking about how the U.S. military used him, or talking about how the U.S. government and corporations used him and the U.S. military to basically protect corporate interests around the world, and especially bankers. And what we see going on now, of course, in Ukraine is a prime example of that. And the people that always make money off the suffering of tens of millions of people are usually bankers. And these wars are really good for them. And World War I is no exception. Apparently, right around the early 1900s, J.P. Morgan, even though this was the industrial age and things were good, J.P. Morgan was having a little problem, having some financial issues. And it's no coincidence that in 1913 the Fed was created and the income tax was created, and perfect timing. So it shows us that there was pre-thought about going into World War I, because President Wilson ran on a platform of keeping America out of the European war. And then, of course, by 1917, he was swayed by the bankers and convinced that the United States needed to go into World War I. Millions of young Americans were killed, but thank God the banks were saved. And so it was all planned out. And I think seeing this story makes it very clear, like I pointed out, that the setup of the Federal Reserve and the income tax was a platform with the bankers moving the U.S. towards war, even though most Americans didn't want it. And President Wilson run on a platform of keeping America out of the war. So it was baked in the cake right from the beginning. And so by 1917, of course, President Wilson was having health issues, and there's a lot of speculation that just like Jill Biden with Joe Biden, Edith Wilson, his wife, was actually running things. And there's a interesting character named Colonel House that was the right-hand man of Wilson during his administration. He was kind of the banker representative and the Rothschilds representative. There's a lot of speculation that he was actually running things, and he was certainly pro-war. So it's another example, just like we have now, where the deep state wants to keep sustaining this war in Ukraine. Jill Biden is actually running things. Joe isn't. And we find the same thing in 1917. So history, as Twain said, history doesn't always repeat, but it certainly rhymes. But during that period, of course, Eugene Debs was actually jailed under the Espionage and Sedition Act because he said, he actually came out and said, quote, "We are fighting a war on behalf of the bankers," unquote. So once again, nothing ever really changes. And we find somebody who was actually running for office back then, Eugene Debs, that managed to get jailed for speaking out and telling the truth. And that's something we see repeated in our own times now. Of course, nowadays they would more likely just have somebody like that killed. But the banks, particularly J.P. Morgan, were the ones that were loaning all the European countries to sustain the war in Europe during World War I. And the funds, of course, were funneled back to U.S. corporations and U.S. arms manufacturers. Does that sound familiar? And so part of this quotient that we see now as well is that J.P. Morgan was not only giving these loans to all these European countries, but it necessitated the U.S. going to war in Europe during World War I in order to protect those interests. They wanted to make sure their loans got paid back, but they also had a lucrative business going during the war supplying these loans, and then having a lot of European resources and assets ponied up for collateral to sustain these loans. And not only that, a lot of the corporations and arm manufacturers that J.P. Morgan used were ones that were owned by either J.P. Morgan or their friends. So once again, sounds completely similar to what we experienced in our own time, certainly in this Ukraine situation. And not only that, we had in the middle of all these loans from J.P. Morgan, of course, the Fed was involved, and any Fed-connected banker got in on this business. And not only that, they set it up so that the banks, especially J.P. Morgan, they were there in the middle of the loan. They were in the middle of servicing the loan. They were collecting fees on both ends. So it was just a total cash cow for them. And in fact, there was a lot more millionaires in America after the war than there were before that. The Fed doubled the money supply in the United States but starting in 1914, and that's something we see similar as well. You know, we have the amount of money put into the economy by the Fed, and particularly in wartime. During the Iraq War, it was the same thing, and they're even using that now during the Ukraine War. And but the banks, you know, receive commissions at both ends of the transaction, both the loans and the servicing of the loans, and then of course repayment after the war. And of course the banks also got nervous about the possibility at one point in the war that it looked like Germany and the Axis might win during World War I, and that made them really nervous about not getting their loans paid back at all. So there's the focal point in the Axis as to why the United States got involved in World War I. It had nothing to do with all the jingos about saving democracy and helping our poor European friends. It was about protecting their loans. And once again, this was over 100 years ago, and here we are, and we're doing the same thing. And as I pointed out, millionaires went from 4,000. So before World War I, there was only 4,000 millionaires in the entire United States. But after the war, there was 21,000 millionaires after the war. So war is good business, and another good history lesson about how nothing ever changes. We see the same mechanisms back in World War I and even before World War I that we see now. It's just the same game, different players, but actually in this case the same players, because J.P. Morgan is still around and they're still doing the same thing. And welcome to Ukraine. I'm Useful Idiot, don't you be one too.